Welcome to The Midnight Secrets. The Phantom Tenants. In the bustling heart of New York City, there stood an elegant, historic brownstone building that had been converted into luxury apartments. The property was desirable, with modern amenities and a prime location. However, there was one unit on the top floor that no tenant ever seemed to stay in for long. The apartment was large, with high ceilings, ornate moldings, and large windows that overlooked Central Park. Yet, despite its beauty, every tenant who moved in left within a few months, often without explanation. The building's management was perplexed but didn't ask too many questions. After all, in New York, people moved in and out all the time. But the truth was far more disturbing than they could have imagined. A young couple, Julia and Max, moved into the apartment one spring, thrilled to have found such a gem. They quickly settled in, decorating the space and hosting dinners for friends who marveled at their good fortune. But soon, strange things began to happen. It started with small things: a cold draft in the hallway, lights flickering for no apparent reason, and the sound of footsteps when no one was around. Julia often felt like she was being watched, even when she was alone. At first, she dismissed these occurrences as quirks of an old building, but Max began to experience them too. One night, as they lay in bed, they heard muffled voices coming from the living room. They assumed it was the neighbors, but when the sounds persisted, Max went to investigate. The living room was empty, but the voices continued, growing louder as if a group of people were having a conversation right there in the room. Max checked the hallway and neighboring apartments, but everything was silent. When he returned to the living room, the voices had stopped. Puzzled and slightly unnerved, he went back to bed, but neither he nor Julia could shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the following weeks, the disturbances grew more intense. They began hearing knocking on the walls and doors at all hours of the night. Objects would move on their own, books falling off shelves, chairs sliding across the floor. Julia even woke up one night to find the sheets being pulled off the bed by an unseen force. Terrified, they contacted the building's management, who sent in a maintenance worker to inspect the apartment. He found nothing wrong with the wiring or plumbing that could explain the disturbances. But as he was leaving, he mentioned something strange. "You know, the previous tenants complained about similar things," he said quietly. "But they never stayed long enough for us to figure out what was going on." Desperate for answers, Julia began researching the history of the building. She discovered that in the early 1900s, the brownstone had been a boarding house. The top floor, where their apartment was now, had been divided into several smaller rooms rented out to various tenants, many of whom were immigrants. In 1924, a fire had broken out in the building, and several people on the top floor had died in their rooms, trapped by the flames. Julia was horrified but convinced that the spirits of those who had died in the fire were still haunting the apartment. She and Max decided to bring in a medium to try and communicate with whatever was in their home. The medium, an elderly woman with a calm demeanor, walked through the apartment, her face growing more serious with each step. "There are many spirits here," she said finally. "They are trapped, reliving their final moments over and over. They don't understand that they've died." Julia and Max asked if there was anything they could do to help the spirits move on. The medium suggested a cleansing ritual, but warned that it might not work. "These spirits are strong, and they've been here a long time. They may not want to leave." Desperate to reclaim their home, Julia and Max agreed to the ritual. The medium performed the cleansing, burning sage and chanting prayers. For a few days, the apartment was quiet, and the couple began to relax. But then, the disturbances returned, worse than ever. The voices were louder, almost angry, and the poltergeist activity became violent. Dishes were thrown across the kitchen, doors slammed shut on their own, and one night, Max was pushed down the stairs by an invisible force, breaking his arm. Terrified for their lives, Julia and Max packed their belongings and left the apartment for good. They never returned, leaving behind everything they couldn't carry. The management tried to rent the apartment again, but after hearing the stories from Julia and Max, and the similar experiences of previous tenants, they decided to leave the unit vacant. To this day, the top-floor apartment remains empty, the door sealed shut. But late at night, residents of the building claim they can still hear voices and footsteps coming from above, as the phantom tenants continue their restless existence. The abandoned asylum. In the remote countryside of rural England, there stood an old asylum, long abandoned and left to decay. The building, once a grand Victorian structure, was now overgrown with ivy, its windows shattered, and its walls covered in graffiti. Locals avoided the place, believing it to be haunted by the tormented souls of those who had once been confined within its walls. The asylum had a dark history. In the late 1800s, it had been a place where society's outcasts were sent, those deemed mentally ill, but also the unwanted, the poor, and the orphaned. Conditions were horrific, with patients subjected to cruel treatments and often left to die in squalor. It was said that the spirits of the dead lingered in the asylum, their suffering imprinted on the very fabric of the building. Despite its reputation, the asylum became a popular spot for urban explorers and thrill-seekers who wanted to experience the paranormal. Among them was a group of 4 friends, James, Emma, Tom, and Sarah, who decided to spend the night inside the asylum, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a Ouija board, the group entered the asylum just as the sun was setting. The air inside was thick with the smell of mold and decay, and every footstep echoed through the empty halls. As they explored, they came across old patient records, rusted medical equipment, and rooms where the walls were still stained with something dark. James, the most adventurous of the group, suggested they conduct a séance in what appeared to have been the main treatment room. They set up the Ouija board on an old metal table, surrounded by broken chairs. The air grew colder as they began, the only light coming from their flashlights. At first, nothing happened. The planchette sat motionless on the board as they asked if anyone was there. But then, it began to move, slowly spelling out the word HELP. The group exchanged nervous glances but continued. They asked who needed help, and the board spelled out a name, Margaret. Emma, the most skeptical of the group, asked what had happened to Margaret. The planchette began to move erratically, spelling out disjointed words, pain, screams, fire. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and their flashlights flickered. Tom, who had been filming, saw something on the camera's screen, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. He pointed it out to the others, but when they looked, there was nothing there. Yet the feeling of being watched grew stronger, and the group decided to leave the room. But as they stood to go, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panic set in as they tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature continued to drop, and they could see their breath in the air. Then, they heard it, whispers, soft at first, then growing louder, echoing through the halls. The whispers turned into cries of pain, and the group could hear the clanging of metal, like the sound of chains being dragged across the floor. The shadows on the walls seemed to move on their own, and the sense of dread was overwhelming. Desperate to escape, James threw his weight against the door, and it finally gave way. They ran through the darkened halls, the sounds of anguish following them. As they reached the entrance, the doors suddenly flew open, and they stumbled outside, gasping for air. They didn't stop running until they were far from the asylum, their hearts pounding in their chests. When they finally dared to look back, the asylum stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But they knew what they had experienced was real. Later, when they reviewed the footage, they saw things that chilled them to the bone, shadowy figures moving in the background, objects flying across the room, and, in one frame, the clear image of a woman's face, pale and twisted in agony, staring directly at the camera. The group never spoke of what happened that night to anyone else. They deleted the footage and vowed never to return to the asylum. But the memories haunted them, and the whispers they had heard in the asylum sometimes returned in the dead of night, reminding them of the horrors they had witnessed. The asylum remains abandoned, slowly crumbling into the earth. But those who dare to venture inside often report feeling an overwhelming sense of fear and sadness, as if the spirits of the lost souls still linger, trapped in their torment for all eternity. The haunting of Rosewood Manor. In the rolling hills of Virginia, hidden away from the main road by a dense forest, stood Rosewood Manor, a grand but dilapidated mansion that had once been the jewel of the county. Built in the early 1800s by a wealthy plantation owner, the manor had seen generations of the same family live and die within its walls. But as the years passed, the house fell into disrepair, its grandeur faded, and it was eventually abandoned. Local legend held that Rosewood Manor was haunted by the ghosts of those who had died tragically on the property, most notably, the original owner, Samuel Blackburn, who was said to have gone mad and murdered his entire family before taking his own life. The house had stood empty for decades, but stories of strange lights, eerie sounds, and ghostly apparitions kept people away. That was until the Harrisons, a family from out of state, bought the manor at an auction for a fraction of its worth. The Harrisons, John, his wife Rebecca, and their teenage daughter Lily, were excited to restore the old house to its former glory. They saw the potential in its faded elegance and were undeterred by the stories they had heard from the locals. From the moment they moved in, however, things were not right. The house seemed to groan and creak constantly, as if it were alive. Doors would open and close on their own, and the air inside was always cold, no matter how high they turned up the heat. At night, they often heard soft footsteps echoing down the halls, though they could never find the source. Lily, in particular, felt uneasy in the house. She often heard whispering when she was alone in her room, though she could never make out what was being said. She also started having vivid nightmares of a man with wild eyes and blood-stained hands, standing at the foot of her bed. One evening, while exploring the attic, Lily found an old diary hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The diary belonged to Sarah Blackburn, Samuel's youngest daughter, who had been just 16 when she died. As Lily read through the pages, she learned of the horrors that had taken place in the house. Sarah's entries were filled with fear. She wrote of how her father had changed, becoming increasingly paranoid and violent. He claimed to hear voices telling him to do terrible things. In the final entry, Sarah wrote of her terror as she hid in the attic, knowing that her father was coming for her. The entry ended abruptly, with a large, dark stain on the page that Lily couldn't help but imagine was blood. As she finished reading, Lily felt a chill run down her spine. She looked around the attic, suddenly feeling as though she wasn't alone. The air grew cold, and she heard a faint whisper, calling her name. Panicked, she dropped the diary and fled the attic, vowing never to go back. That night, the house seemed to come alive with activity. The temperature dropped sharply, and the lights flickered on and off. Doors slammed shut, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the halls. The family could hear voices, angry and frightened, shouting and screaming. John and Rebecca tried to calm Lily, who was nearly hysterical, but the terror in the house was palpable. Then, as they huddled together in the living room, they saw it, the ghostly figure of a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, standing in the doorway. His eyes were wild, and his face twisted in a mask of rage. Behind him, they could see the faint outlines of others, women and children, who seemed to be trapped in an eternal nightmare. The apparition of Samuel Blackburn stepped forward, raising a hand as if to strike. But just as he moved, the figure of a young girl appeared in front of him, her expression sad but resolute. It was Sarah. She stood between her father and the Harrisons, holding up her hand as if to stop him. The other spirits seemed to shrink back, their anger turning to sorrow. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a final, anguished cry, the figures faded away, and the house fell silent. The temperature returned to normal, and the lights stopped flickering. The Harrisons were shaken but unharmed. The next morning, John and Rebecca decided they could no longer stay in the house. They packed up their belongings and left Rosewood Manor, leaving it to the ghosts that still roamed its halls. The house stands empty once more, slowly falling into ruin. But those who pass by on the road say they sometimes see a light in the attic window and hear the faint sound of a piano playing, as if the spirits of Rosewood Manor are still there, trapped in their tragic past, unable to find peace.